You ready?
Ready.
Okay, great. Kristen Amiet is the producer of the Australian's daily news podcast, The Front. She's also our podcast reviewer in the review section every Saturday. Kristen, you're our in-house podcast expert, but can you remember what your first podcast that you listened to was?
I think one of the first ones, and one that still rates as one of my favourite podcasts that I've ever listened to, it's at a very high standard as far as I consider podcasts, was Dolly Parton's America. It was this kind of accidental podcast, and I know that some of the best podcasts we listen to are all like, oh, this just happened, or someone just moved in next door. And then I had this amazing story quite literally on my doorstep. But this, it was released in 2019. It is very much an exploration of Dolly Parton's musical career and the impact that she's had on culture, but it's also this really interesting dynamic look at America and the way that this woman, who is from what she calls her Tennessee mountain home, a tiny shack up in the mountains in Tennessee, has this kind of unmatched cross-cultural appeal. And I thought, I wonder what it is like looking at America through that prism at this time and in this moment when there is another Appalachian figure out there, potentially, and now we know, on the road to the White House. I think that's significant because podcast pop culture adjacency, I think, has caused them to be discounted by traditional media, but also to be lumped in with social media in the sense that there was a belief for a very long time that anybody could whack on a voice memo and call it a podcast. But we do know that podcasts are an incredibly intimate medium. You're quite literally in people's ears. You're with them while they're gardening or cooking or doing the school drop-off. And we know that people retain and comprehend information differently, not necessarily better, but differently when they listen to a podcast. We saw Donald Trump on Joe Rogan's podcast, which has been and still is one of the biggest podcasts in the world. We saw Kamala Harris appear on Alex Cooper's podcast, Call Her Daddy. We've since learned that Alex Cooper's team did indeed have conversations with Donald Trump about a potential appearance from him. And that has perpetuated a really interesting conversation, I think, about who gets to be in the media, who gets to participate in politics, and curiosity around why these particular titles resonate with such a huge number of people to the point where they are arguably having an impact on the democratic process.
Yeah, those two podcasts are real examples of the polarisation of the audience, aren't they? It's mainly men who listen to Joe Rogan, although of course not exclusively, and a lot of women listen to Call Her Daddy. And I think that's an interesting point you raise about the pop culture adjacency of podcasts. I mean, they are regarded by the audience really as an entertainment product and treated as an entertainment product in a way that the news media perhaps isn't always. I think people are a little more perhaps confused or ambiguous about the way they regard the news. Is it entertainment or is it some sort of service? Personally, I think it should be entertainment. It should be entertaining no matter what kind of story you're telling. Do you think that change in the way podcasts are regarded, the mainstreaming, I guess, of podcasts into that establishment conversation, has improved the quality?
Yes and no. There is a weird intersection of podcasts and social media in particular where, you know, I see it myself if I log on to TikTok or Instagram, I see clips from podcasts that I don't actually listen to, but yet I will watch all of those clips and consume them in that capacity. And on the flip side, there are podcasts that I listen to purely as an audio product that I never really engage with what they do outside of that.
It's interesting, isn't it, how in the evolution from radio to podcasting, it seemed like everything was going to be a bit more intentional. You know, you've made the choice to click on a podcast and rather than the radio just kind of whittering on in the background with some interesting stuff and some not very interesting stuff. What is that? Is it sort of comfort food for the audience?
I think so. There's something that people say about podcasts and about their particular effectiveness and their ability to engage people, which is that a lot of people listen, as I said, when they're gardening, cooking, cleaning. I know I certainly do that. And they say that's because you've got busy hands, free mind. You can kind of, and I guess the same could be said of audiobooks, although an audiobook, you wait for the payoff for a lot longer. You might have to wait 8 or 12 chapters until you figure out a resolution in something. But in podcasts, we know that we have to give people that sometimes in 8 or 12 minutes. And so there is something to be said about just having something on in the background. Perhaps that's what people are kind of engaging in. It is feeling maybe less alone, feeling like you have company, and maybe it's not the way that they're talking about it or even what they're talking about. It's just having a voice that you relate to that is there playing while you are going about your life.
Kristen, you've listened to an awful lot of podcasts in your life and in 2024. So I'm going to go through some of the big categories and I'm going to ask you what's your best ever and what's the best of 2024 in your opinion. True crime, best ever. One of the best I've ever listened to is Sweet Bobby. That was Tortoise Media's investigation into what had happened to a young English woman when a romance had apparently gone really badly wrong. The twists and turns in that one were absolutely amazing. I won't ruin it for the audience, but it took you to places that we didn't expect to go. Tortoise Media is quite remarkable, aren't they?
They are. They've really emerged as a power player in podcasts. For a long time, we've had big networks like Wondery putting out productions like Dirty John were some of the big first ones. And yes, I would rank Sweet Bobby as probably my favourite true crime podcast of all time. As you said, their ability to take you on this journey and to not see what's coming. And not only that, their ability to do it in 6 episodes is pretty incredible, to kind of condense what could have been 20 episodes if they wanted it to be, and to do it really sensitively, I think. And that's a big part of the evolution that I think has gone on in podcasts over the last decade or so, is at first, particularly in true crime, it was a little bit salacious. It was a little bit almost romanticising these awful crimes that had been committed by awful people. Now it's a lot more victim-centric and it's a lot more considerate of the experiences that people have had and the people around them as well.
Another category is lifestyle. My husband, like a lot of men, is absolutely obsessed with Car Talk, an American podcast with 2 Italian-American guys talking about cars. What about you? What was your best lifestyle podcast ever and maybe of 2024?
I would say my favourite lifestyle podcast ever is one that's been published for a couple of years and probably falls into the science and wellness aspect of the overarching umbrella, that is lifestyle. That is Maintenance Phase. It's actually an indie podcast. It's by 2 hosts in the US, Michael Hobbs, who is a journalist, and Aubrey Gordon, who is a blogger, activist. They've both worked in the not-for-profit sector. And what they do is debunk what they call junk science and quote-unquote legitimate science, diet culture, but their way of doing it is very entertaining. What we were talking about entertainment before, they've known each other for a very long time. Their dynamic is very funny. They do this over Zoom, and to get the kind of interactions that they get over Zoom, we know can be quite difficult, but that just goes to show how well they get along and how well they know each other. They've done Mel Gibson, so it does have an Australian spin every now and then. Or they might pick a particular diet book and they might go through that and go, where did this come from? Or just a concept that's been in the culture for a long time.
Another one that reminds me of an Australian one that I love called Do You Fucking Mind, hosted by Alexis Fernandez. I think I've tried to get you to listen to this numerous times. I think you're too busy with Maintenance Phase. But Alexis Fernandez is a young Australian woman who went and did a neuroscience degree because she was intrigued by how the brain works. So each episode is a combination of brain facts, how the brain works, and then her incredibly foul-mouthed but very clever and very entertaining take on relationship issues, whether it's how to deal with toxic parents-in-law or how to know when your friends are idiots, and there's something about her generation's fluency in the language of mental health and the fact that they're dealing with the problems that everybody throughout human history has dealt with. I'm loving hearing all of this from a woman in her 20s perspective. Okay, what about comedy and humour? Anything funny you've listened to?
Something that I love that is always in my rotation and that is quite comforting in its consistency, because the format never changes. Even if they do a live show, it is always reliably the same format every single week. I think they've done almost 600 episodes now, and that is No Such Thing as a Fish, which is, when I say that to people, they're like, what is this about? On that show, they have QI elves. They are the researchers. These are people who have degrees in physics, in English literature, but also who are really annoyingly funny in that just lovable, bleak English way. And so 4 of them come together and they bring their favourite fact that they have found that week. It can be about absolutely anything. And as the show has gone on, they've gotten more and more obscure. And of course, there's no such thing as a fish is one of the first facts that was surfaced in this series way back when. It's just really entertaining to listen to, and you do learn things. I find myself constantly saying to people, oh, I heard this on an episode of No Such Thing as a Fish, that did you know blah, blah, blah. So it makes me really good at pub trivia, if nothing else. But it's a really entertaining, fun listen, and if you've got kids in the car, probably fine for them to listen to as well.
Kristen, thank you very much.
Thank you.